So as we get closer to February of 2022, there's a few other key moments. Maybe let's talk about in July 2021, Putin publishing an essay titled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Can you describe the ideas expressed in this essay?
The idea is very conveniently presented already in the first paragraph, in the first sentences, really, of the article, where Putin says that for a long time I was saying that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people, and here is the proof. This is the historical. He develops his historical argumentation apparently with the help of a lot of people around him. And he started to talk about Russians and Ukrainians being one and the same people 1 year before the start of the war in 2014. So in 2013, he was together with Patriarch Kirill on visit to Kiev, and there was a conference specifically organized for him in the Kievan Caves monastery, and that's where he stated that. The fact that he was with Patriarch Kirill is very important factor for understanding where the idea is coming from. This is the idea that was dominant in the Russian Empire of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are really Great Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians, and that they constitute one people. Yes, there are some dialectical differences. Yes, Ukrainians sing well. Yes, they dance funny, but overall, that doesn't matter. And that idea actually was really mostly destroyed by the revolution of 1917. Because it wasn't just social revolution. That's how it is understood in US and good part of the world. It was also national revolution. It was an empire. It was a revolution in the Russian Empire. And to bring these pieces of empire back within the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks had to make concessions. And one of those concessions was to recognition of the existence of Ukrainians as a separate nation, Belarusians as a separate nations, Russians as a separate nations, endowing them with their own territorial, with borders, with institutions, and so on and so forth. But there was one institution that was not reformed. That institution was called the Russian Orthodox Church. Because one of the ways that Bolsheviks dealt with it, they couldn't eradicate religion completely, but they arrested the development of the religion and thinking and theology on the level as it existed before the revolution of 1917. So the Russian Orthodox Church of 1917 continued to be the Russian Orthodox Church in 1991 and in 2013, continuing the same imperial mantra of the existence of one big Russian nation, one unified people. And when you see the formation of the ideas about nations, about foreign policy in the Russian Empire after 1991, they're going back to the pre-Bolshevik times. Ukrainians do that as well. Estonians do that as well. The difference is that when Ukrainians go back, they go back to the pre-1917, their intellectual fathers and writings of basically liberal nationalism. Or sometimes they go to the radical nationalism of Bandera, which would be not pre-1917, but pre-1945. When the Russians go to pre-Bolshevik past, looking for the ideas, looking for inspiration, looking for the narratives, what they find there is empire. What they find there are imperial projects, and that's certainly the story of the Putin's claim. That's the story of the argument. And to conclude, the argument that he lays out there, historical argument, comes also almost directly from the narratives of the late 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. So it's not only the argument is coming from that era, but also the argumentation is coming from that era as well.
But those arguments are all in the flavor of empire.
It's empire on the one hand, but also there is imperial understanding of what Russian nation is. That doesn't allow for independence of its Little Russian and White Russian branches, alleged branches, right? So what you see with the concept of the big Russian nation, that's late 19th, beginning 20th century. Empire sees the writing on the wall, that nationalism is on the rise, and it tries to survive by mobilizing the nationalism of the largest group in the empire, which happens to be Russian. Stalin is a big promoter of some form of Russian nationalism, especially during the war and after war. And he started his career as a very promising Georgian writer, writing in Georgian.
Yeah.
So he's not doing that for some personal affinity or cultural intellectual roots within Russian nation or Russian people. He is doing that for the sake of the success of his Soviet and communist project, and he has to get the largest ethnic group on board, which are Russians. But Stalin and Putin have different understanding who Russians are. Stalin already accepted Ukrainians and Belarusians, their existence. Putin goes back to pre-Stalin and pre-Lenin times.
So if we step back from the historical context of this and maybe the geopolitical purpose of writing such an essay, and forget about the essay altogether. I have family in Ukraine and Russia. I know a lot of people in Ukraine and Russia. Forget the war, forget all of this. There's a they all kind of sound the same. Like if I go to France, they sound different than in Ukraine and Russia. Like if you lay out the cultural map of the world, there's just a different beat and music and flavor to a people. I guess what I'm trying to say is there seems to be a closeness between the cultures of Ukraine and Russia. Like how do we describe that? Do we acknowledge that? And how does that add tension with the national independence?
First of all, especially when it comes to Eastern Ukraine or to big cities, many people in Ukraine spoke Russian, right?
Mm-hmm.
Generally, it's the same language. On the top of that, we started our discussion with talking about the Slavs, right? So both Ukrainian and Russian language are Slavic languages. So there is proximity there as well. On the top of that, there is a history of existence in the Soviet Union and before that in one empire for a long period of time. So you see a lot of before the war, a lot of Ukrainian singers and entertainers performing in Russia and vice versa. And biography of President Zelensky is certainly one of the fits that particular model as well. That all talks about similarities, but these similarities also very often obscure things that became so important in the course of this war. And I already mentioned the book titled by President Kuchma of Ukraine, "Ukraine is not Russia." So that's the argument. Despite the fact that you think that we are the same, we behave differently. And it turned out that they behave differently. You have Bolotnaya in Moscow and police violence, and that's the end of it. You have the Maidan in Ukraine, and you have police violence, and that's the beginning. That's not the end. History really matters in the way why sometimes people speaking the same language with different accents behave very differently. Russia and Russian identity was formed around the state and has difficulty imagining itself outside of the state. And that state happened to be imperial for most of Russian history.
Mhm.
Ukrainian project came into existence in revolt against the state. Ukraine came into existence out of the parts of different empires, which means they left different cultural impact on them. And for Ukrainians to stay together, autocratic regime so far didn't work. It's like the colonies of the United States. You have to find common language. You have to talk to each other. And that became part of the Ukrainian political DNA. And that became a huge factor in the war. And very few people in Ukraine believed what Vladimir Putin was saying, that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people. But the majority believed that they're certainly close culturally and historically nations. And from that point of view, the bombardment of the Ukrainian cities became such a shock to the Ukrainians. Because deep down, they maybe looked at Syria, they looked at Chechnya, and were explaining that through the fact that there was basically such a big cultural gap and difference between Russians and those countries and those nations. But my understanding, at least, most of them had difficulty imagining the war of that proportion and that sort of ferocity and that sort of war crimes, bringing that sort of war crimes and on that level.
So it's interesting that you say that in the DNA of Ukraine versus Russia. So maybe Russia is more conducive to authoritarian regimes, and Ukraine is more conducive to defining itself by rebelling against authoritarian regimes.
By rebellion, absolutely. And that was the story pretty much before 1991. So, what you see since 1991 and what you see today is, I would say, new factor, certainly in Ukrainian modern history. Because Ukrainians traditionally were very successful rebels. The largest peasant army in the civil war in the Russian Empire was the Makhno army in southern Ukraine. And one revolt, Cossack revolts and other revolts, one after another. But Ukrainians had historically difficulty actually maintaining the sort of freedom that they acquired, had difficulty associating themselves with the state. And what we see, especially in the last 2 years, it's a quite phenomenal development in Ukraine when Ukrainians associate themselves with the state, where Ukrainians see a state not just as a foreigner, as historically it was in Ukrainian history, not just someone who came to take, but the state that is continuation of them, that helps to provide security for them, that the Ukrainian armed forces, even before the start of this war, had the highest support and popularity in Ukraine. The state today functions unbelievably effectively under attacks and missile attacks, and again, city government and local government. And we are witnessing, when it comes to Ukraine, we are witnessing a very important historical development where Ukrainians found their state for the first time through most of their history, and try to make a transition from successful rebels to successful managers and state builders.